In this skill assignment, I'd like you to think about and explore the ways in which we encounter psychological scientific information most commonly, and how we go about taking the research that you're reading about in this section and getting it out into the world so that interested people can consume it and then can use that research ideally to better their lives. So how does this process go from the creation of the information to the dissemination of that information? Most of the research in psychological science is conducted by researchers in university settings or sometimes in corporate research labs. That information, as you've read about in this unit, is conducted in a really scientifically rigorous way to test very specific questions about human thinking, feeling, and behaving. That information is then written by those scientists and reported in scientific journals. Those journals are written by professional scientists for the consumption of other professional scientists. Now, the interesting thing about this kind of writing is that it's rather technical and particular. And it goes through a process that we call the peer review cycle. What this means is that we take the results of our research, we write it in a formal way, and then we submit that research to journals. These scientific journals go through an editorial and review process, whereby a volunteer editor reviews the paper and decides whether or not it's scientifically meritorious enough to be considered for publication in the journal. If it passes that first test, that person sends the paper anonymously to 3 scientists with expertise in the field about which the paper is researching. Those reviewers then try to pick apart the paper and find any scientific or methodological flaws that could bring the results for the paper into question. If those reviewers find the paper to be worthy of publication, and the editor agrees, then the paper is published in a scientific journal for others to read, review, and cite. What this means is that anything that comes out of one of these scientific journals has been carefully vetted by other scientists who are experts in the field to ensure its careful attention to detail and methodological soundness. Unfortunately, what that means is that often, because these publications are written by scientists for scientists, they're dense and difficult to understand. So let's talk about the different ways in which that information is presented. For example, here's a research article that I had published in the Journal of Positive Psychology a couple of years ago. The title is "Humble Persons Are More Helpful Than Less Humble Persons: Evidence from 3 Studies." The basic point here is we're finding that people who are more humble, that is, focus less on themselves and have a relatively appropriate sense of their ability in different areas, are more helpful in various social situations than those who are more arrogant. The details of this study are provided throughout this research article. We'll just look together at the abstract, the portion of the paper that briefly explains the whole. It's a scientific summary of the material. Connections between humility and other prosocial qualities led us to develop a humility-helpfulness hypothesis. In 3 studies, humble persons were more helpful than less humble persons. In Study 1, participants, 117, completed self-report measures of humility, the Big Five, and helpfulness. In Study 2, participants, 90, completed an implicit measure of humility and were presented with an unexpected opportunity to help someone in need. In Study 3, participants, 103, completed self-report and implicit measures of humility and were presented a similar helping opportunity. Humility and helpfulness correlated positively when personality and impression management were controlled. Humble participants helped more than did less humble participants, even when agreeableness and desirable responding were statistically controlled. Further, implicit humility uniquely predicted helping behavior in an altruistic motivation condition. As you can see, this abstract is chock full of jargon, words that scientists use to communicate very specific ideas to other scientists. While this specificity is very important for other scientists to be able to carefully interpret the information and for them to be able to replicate those studies, a process we talked about in this unit, that jargon is ultimately pretty confusing, I think, for people who don't read this kind of scientific information. If I was trying to communicate this with someone who doesn't understand the science but is smart, like my grandma, for example, this would not be the kind of language that I'd want to use. But this is the only type of writing that scientists are professionally rewarded for, so it's the only type of writing that scientists typically do. So how does psychological scientific information make it into the public sphere? Most of the time, the way this happens is through what we talk about as the scientific news cycle. You can see it sort of parodied here in a comic by PhD Comics, where we start with this scientific journal article, like we just looked at, that talks about the details of the science, so that we have a conclusion where A is correlated with B, given C, assuming D under E conditions. Really super qualified to help with a lot of scientific detail. Then that gets translated by your university PR office, which we do have at the University of Maine. And they send out a press release that says something like, for immediate release, scientists find potential link between A and B, and give some of that qualifying certain conditions. The university PR offices usually do a really nice job of translating the science to news. Unfortunately, those news organizations are interested not only in communicating scientific information, but also in drawing in readers and to write something that's sellable. So while scientists are communicating their research to advance knowledge at the edge of understanding with extreme specificity, journalists, on the other hand, are doing really important work of translating that material into something that's understandable and applicable, but also something that's sellable. And as a result, news organizations tend to take these qualified, careful statements and turn them into causal statements that aren't supported by the research. So we might have something like, A causes B, say scientists, even though that's not at all what the scientists said. These newswire organizations get picked up by sites on the internet and end up on the cable news, where things start to escalate, where A causes B all the time, and we start thinking about how that relates to major geopolitical issues. By the time it gets to grandma through the local news, it's been woefully misinterpreted, and no longer is the public necessarily understanding the reality of the research. So it's our job as researchers to help facilitate this scientific news cycle, to help interpret, as scientists, some of this information by going back to the original journal articles and reading those as informed scientists, which is what we're going to practice in some upcoming skills. Right now, though, what I want you to focus on is identifying good scientific journalism. That is, journalism published by journalists, not scientists, that's focused on communicating scientific information and does so in a really good way, avoiding some of these pitfalls that we see in this comedy. There are several journalistic enterprises that report science very well. You'll find these at reputable sources on the internet, things like Huffington Post, The Atlantic, Guardian, New York Times Science, and other journalistic organizations that are really dedicated to getting information out, but still have some of the forces of a capitalistic economy behind them, and by that I mean are still trying to encourage people to read their particular brand of that news. As a result, they tend to write really compelling and also scientifically accurate articles. But recognize that journalists themselves typically are not scientists, and as a result, they're interpreting scientific information. The best scientific journalism not only describes the science in a way that people can understand, but also includes references directly to the research in a journal article, like the one we looked at previously. And the very best includes interviews with the researchers themselves, who are able to get the opportunity to try to communicate that research in a valuable way to the public. So for example, I've just pulled up a few articles. This one from the Huffington Post looks at the surprising science of praise. So you can tell just in this title that what this is looking to do is drive some clicks, but also provide some valuable information. What this article does is talk about some of the basic research, linking to specific journal articles that people could read, and describing the findings of very specific studies. Now, often, these kinds of articles can direct you right back to valuable primary literature in journal articles through their links. You can also see the extent to which they're talking directly to researchers, like this article talks about a series of specific studies by Carol Dweck. In this example from the New York Times, a couple of journalists describe the trick to acting heroically. In the wake of the terrorist attacks in France, these authors set out to understand the research behind when we act in self-sacrificial ways, something that psychologists try to understand. These journalists do an excellent job describing the research methods that were used to come to specific conclusions about who helps in self-sacrificial ways in specific situations. and they direct you right to the primary research. One other category of scientific journalism is described here in this Atlantic article. Now, this article is written directly by Paul Bloom, who himself is the researcher who conducted all of this research. This is an example of a researcher doing the important work of communicating science not just to other scientists, but also to the public in meaningful ways. Paul Bloom's research focuses on happiness and gratitude, and ways that we can be happier ourselves. So what Paul is doing in this article is describing a series of studies that help people understand ways that they might be happier. However, not all scientific journalism is as great as those that we've just recently looked at. Some of those scientific journalists get off the rails a little bit, kind of like that PhD comic that we looked at a few moments ago. You might recall that humility article I showed you a few minutes ago. This is Cosmopolitan's coverage of that article. And you can see it doesn't quite have the heft of these other examples we looked at earlier. For example, file this under research we could figure out ourselves. Cocky people aren't likely to help out when you need a hand. In a series of studies, researchers from the University of Maine discovered that humble people think that quiet girl in your office who's a silent rock star, your friend who never brags about her amazing skills, are the best ones to reach out when you need backup. Essentially, if someone is already nice, they're more likely to be nice when you need them. Dope. You can tell the flippant style, but more importantly, what this journalist has done is really mischaracterize the key concept of humility, and also mischaracterize the research relating humility to, quote, niceness. As a result, this article not only is sort of not helpful, but it actually misrepresents the science in a way that completely misrepresents the conclusions. So if people are reading this to be informed about science, they're actually going to be less informed about the state of the science after reading this article than before it. This is the reason why this piece of the course is so important, because I want you to be able to identify good scientific journalism, and that is journalism that directs you right to the primary source, which we'll talk about how to find in the next skill unit.